Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here and the privilege to come up to Pretoria and bring some of the ocean with me into the inland and present it to some of you guys and some of the work that we're doing down in Cape Town, in Rosebank and in Stellenbosch. I'm going to be talking a bit about ocean robotics today, so robots in the ocean and how we've been starting to use them around marine resource management and understanding some of the ocean services that they can be used for in the ocean. This work would not have been done without some of the work of my colleagues. I recognize Pedro Montero made it here today. And then in some of the applications, the outward applications that have been occurring from the science, we've been collaborating with DPSS and individuals there, Hannah Seatsman and Neil Goslet, to implement some of these services beyond the ocean robotics. So I take you, though, few steps back and emerge this into some of the science rationale that we've been doing in the last 4 years before I explain some of the ocean services. And so I take you to the Southern Ocean, and Francois gave a great little base for me to step into this area because he really did highlight why the Southern Ocean is so important for us and our understanding of the climate in the Southern Hemisphere around Southern Africa and globally. And one of the real issues around the Southern Ocean is that really there's so much CO2 is taken up in the Southern Ocean, and 50% of all the CO2 that's taken up oceanically is in this region alone. And yet we know very little about the Southern Ocean, how it works. We have very few observations here. And so this induces a lot of uncertainty into understanding the role of the Southern Ocean in global climate. And I have this complex picture, and I don't want you to focus on all the complex processes and mechanisms that are happening here, but what I do want to emphasize is that it is very complex. There's a lot going on here, and if we don't understand the Southern Ocean properly, we won't understand the balance of carbon dioxide, of heat, etc., that extends throughout the world's oceans and global climate. And yet, in this very complex area, we have very few observations. So very few observations of the ocean and the impacts that are occurring above that from the atmosphere to the ocean. And so our understanding is limited in terms of the observations. And then I introduce here some of the data that we see from the satellite. And I do this to show you some of the scales of variability that happen in the Southern Ocean. So here we have satellite data looking at the ocean color, and this gives us an understanding of how much chlorophyll or phytoplankton are growing in the surface waters of the Southern Ocean. And this is just a monthly picture. And you can see that there's a lot of variability occurring here, even at the monthly scale, the monthly climatology. There's a lot of variability in space. You have these patches of phytoplankton bloom occurring in the Southern Ocean. And in time, temporarily, there's these lots of bursts of energy and variability that occurs in the Southern Ocean. And then even at a greater scale, and I'll start that again, see, there we go, we have the winds of the Southern Ocean as measured from a satellite scatterometer. And you can see that really there's a lot going on there at just a few hourly time scales. So this just really emphasizes that we need to go out into the Southern Ocean, into these areas, and observe them at much higher space and time scales. The Southern Ocean is massive, it's remote, so it's difficult to do this. It's beyond the capabilities of individuals or even just one or two nations. And then it's really rough. It's not a great place to go and do work on everyday scenario. You know, big storms and harsh and remote environments make observing these areas very difficult. And so we require new technologies to make inroads into those areas around observing the system. And for that reason, we really embarked a few years ago, now almost 5 years ago, on investing in ocean robotics to fill that gap, to fill that niche in obtaining observations at much more improved temporal and spatial scales. And so what we have, for example, here is one of our robots, these gliders that dive to 1 kilometer depth and back to the surface, are doing that on a continuous basis and sending us the data in real time by satellite data to the researchers here in South Africa and globally. So CSIR researchers are receiving the data and giving new commands to these gliders to go somewhere else and sample in a different way in which we're going to improve our understanding of these areas. And one particular uniqueness about the gliders is that before we had gliders, and this is sort of a Venn diagram in space and time. So here we have the spatial scales going from small to big and the time from very short to long time scales there. And you see that ships were very well adapted at doing the large spatial scale sampling, so they could go over 1,000 kilometers in quite a short period of time. Moorings are stuck in one place in the ocean. They're just fast moorings that are sampling only one area, but very good at sampling the time scales, but they don't go anywhere, so they're not covering the spatial areas. And so in order to understand the full seasonal cycle dynamics of the Southern Ocean and its impacts on climate projections, we required other instruments to fill those space and time scales so we could start to sample the seasonal cycle and beyond. And that was really being used by ocean robotics, and in this case what I refer to as ocean gliders. So it's really a crucial mechanism to understand that. Right, so blank screen, it's not a technical fault here, but actually, if you think about 50 years ago, our insights into understanding what the Southern Ocean was, what was happening in the Southern Ocean, might have looked something like that. Very little understanding of what's going on there. And in the years that came and the decades that came beyond that, we had ships that were able to go down to the Southern Ocean and take measurements, always limited to from the ship. And so there we might receive just a little bit of data. So that's just an idea of some of the data that would come out of the Southern Ocean. And we call that a snapshot, a sample of what's happening in the Southern Ocean. Because the ship can't be there for very long periods of time. It's really expensive to use a ship. Each day that we use a ship might cost around 300,000 rands just for this fuel. And the ship, cannot be there for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months with people on board. It's just not feasible. And so with the evolution of gliders, this capability, what we were able to do was enhance that snapshot view of the Southern Ocean into a much more prolonged time and space scale observations of the Southern Ocean from gliders. So this is just a little example of some of the data that we collected now over 3 years ago in the first Southern Ocean seasonal cycle experiment from one glider. It's just half the time series. And you can see this is temperature over here, and this is chlorophyll at the bottom of the last panel. And you can see that there's a lot of stuff going on in the ocean, a lot of variability that we're now able to observe from gliders in the Southern Ocean. This is our current fleet of gliders, the CSIR fleet. And we have 9 gliders in total, and 5 of them are profiling gliders. They're going up and down the ocean water column to 1,000 meters depth and back to the surface. And then we have another 4 of them, and these are called surface wave gliders. And they use wave energy to move around the world's ocean at around 2 knots or so, collecting data of the surface properties of the ocean, and particularly very useful at looking at the flux of carbon dioxide that's moving between the ocean and the atmosphere. And this is all maintained in a facility that we've been building in the last couple of years, which is called the South African Marine Engineering and Robotics Center, which is down in Cape Town, based near the waterfront, in close collaboration with the Department of Environmental Affairs. So just a few years ago, we deployed some of these gliders in the Southern Ocean. This is just a map to show you how far away from Cape Town we are working in these very climate important areas of the ocean. And you can see here some of the gliders that we deployed in 2012. And these gliders were able to continuously sample for up to 6 months at a time before the ship went down again and picked them up at the end of the Antarctic summer season that we have each year. This is an example of just one variable of data. So this is mixed layer depth. Now it doesn't need to be very meaningful to you, but it's the depth at which there is mixing in the upper ocean. And this was some of the data that we looked at before we had gliders. So these are some products that are available, Reanalysis and gridded products from all the observations in those areas put together. And you can see the blue line is some monthly data that we have. The red line is a weekly data, and you see it's got more variability in the data. But indeed, actually, there's a lot missing. And the black line is the same as from the same area that's collected from a glider. And you can see that, wow, there's huge changes in the upper ocean that were not captured by the Reanalysis products that we were using the years before that. All this all this work and the scientific research in the Southern Ocean and through the Southern Ocean Carbon and Climate Observatory is done in an integrated fashion. We can't just rely on gliders to do our work, and we really, one of the unique niches of CSIR Earth System Science here is that we involve different platforms to do integrated Earth System Science. So the gliders and the robotics is one area, but of course merging that with the other observational platforms, the satellites and the research ship is another. And then of course, which Francois spoke much more in detail about, that is the high performance computing and the numerical modeling analysis that's occurring within CSIR as well. And this is a unique niche that we hold here in South Africa in a global perspective. There are challenges. So, you know, these robots, you know, are fantastic vehicles to do our work with, but sometime at sea, and you can see that these gooseneck barnacles are having a great time growing on these gliders. So just after a few months, this glider was experiencing issues with some of its sensors, and so these barnacles were growing on these gliders. Even though these gliders were diving to 1,000 meters depth, these gooseneck barnacles were still having a super time growing and flourishing on the glider parts during that mission. We have a live mission currently going on, so we're now into the third Southern Ocean seasonal cycle experiment, and crucially here the importance was that we deployed these gliders and we did observations from the ship in July, so that's midwinter, and we're receiving some of the first midwinter observations that we've ever received from the Southern Ocean, and these gliders are still down there. Four gliders are down there, and so these are just some of the areas that they're sampling. One is in this octagon sampling fashion, the surface wave glider with the sea glider in the middle, profiling underneath it. And here's just some of the salinity information that we've received for the last few days. And so they'll continue there and complete a full seasonal cycle of data from the subantarctic zone of the Southern Ocean. So with that perspective of the Southern Ocean, I take a step back and we come a bit closer to South Africa and its exclusive economic zone. And one aspect around that's been driving from the science is about how do we make an impact on this huge space that we have of this exclusive economic zone of South Africa that is actually greater than the whole surface area of South Africa. So we're dealing here with about 1.5 million square kilometers of exclusive economic zone that South Africa is supposed to manage and be in control of and understand what is happening in its EEZ. And so this is a huge problem. How are we going to, in the future, manage these resources that are within the exclusive economic zone? So, and also in the upcoming years, we're seeing the extended continental shelf claim, which will effectively double this size of surface area of the ocean, which is quite challenging. And so there are a number of issues that are occurring in the EEZ. There is poaching, there is problems around resource management, there is protecting South Africa's marine protected areas, etc., etc., etc. And we don't currently have enough capability to effectively manage this area. So for example, the last point there is that the satellite information that we have coming in from satellite-based and remote sensing platforms and others, land-based radar, etc., is not enough to effectively manage this EEZ. One example that I'm focusing on today is actually the state of South African fisheries. And in particular is the aspect of how they've been overfished in the last couple of decades, and that we've seen a huge collapse in a number of species around South Africa's coastline that are living in our EEZ. And so example here is that some of the line fisheries have collapsed. 68% of them have collapsed in the last few years, and this was a report that came out a few years ago by the WWF, and there are other areas there around how we are not having a full understanding about how fisheries are actually occurring in South Africa. So the amount of fisheries that are being actually fully fished in South Africa is around about half. And this is obviously extremely a difficult challenge to overcome if we are to see sustained fisheries resource management in South Africa. So even though there's this big problem, we don't yet collect enough information about fisheries in South Africa's waters. And so each year, DAF undergoes a fisheries survey, and that's either 1 to 2 times a year, whereby they transect areas of South Africa's EEZ to have a fuller understanding of what is the biomass variability occurring in South Africa's waters. And each of these surveys is extremely expensive and resource heavy. So we have each survey costing around about 50 to 60 million. They require a lot of resources from ship's time, people's capabilities and time and manpower to undertake these surveys. And it's not enough that's being done to effectively manage those fishery stocks. So some solution that could be found in this is deploying these wave gliders in conjunction with DAF fishery surveys to really reduce the time and enhance considerably the amount of data that we're collecting on fish stocks and abundance in the waters around our coastline, and effectively reduce the reliance on ship-based surveys alone. This is really crucial. And so what we've done in the last few months and last year and a half or so is what we've integrated an acoustics fisheries observing system into our wave glider. So effectively the wave glider can transect parts of the ocean around South Africa's coast, measure fish abundance via acoustic sensors, send the data to us in real time via satellite data, and then we have a number of steps by which an end product can be available for fisheries managers, for scientists, etc. And the broad knock-on effects of this are not just about observing fish. It's about having presence in our exclusive economic zone. So on these platforms, we can have additional sensors that are around understanding the surveillance and who's in our territorial waters, as well as having additional scientific sensors that allow us to enhance the sciences in our waters as well. Here is the actual integrated acoustic sensor on our wave glider. So this is the wave glider just in the harbor getting ready, and obviously the engineers use any excuse to get the wetsuits on and get into the water. And so here you can see the surface platform that we've been using for a number of years, and this is the integrated acoustic sensor that we have here trailered on the back of our wave gliders to collect that acoustics data for fisheries abundance. So we had to actually integrate the system away from the main hull there because of data interference with some of the subunits that were of the original vehicle, and how they were interfering with some of the data from just below the surface. So in fact, now we're able to provide presence within our waters and actually have a more quasi-permanent presence of these gliders in our waters, providing quality data on resources in South Africa's coastal waters. And the applications, as I mentioned before, can be way beyond just the fisheries acoustics data. It's around enhancing the science observations, environmental monitoring. You may even be able to do the oil spill response, hydrocarbon sniffing, effectively that is, having additional weather platforms out there in the coastal waters and beyond, and maritime security and safety. Recently, we just completed some of our major sea trials. So just last month, at the beginning of last month, we completed this big survey together with DAF. And this is the island surveys that occur off the west coast of South Africa. And so here is Dasson Island. I'm sorry if these lines are not very clear, but Dasson Island is located here just off Azefontein. And each month, DAF uses a small boat, a small ship survey to do this grid survey around the island to measure the fish stocks that are occurring there. And you can see the fish abundance is these shaded colors of where these fish populations are occurring around the island. And so what we aimed to do was we took our wave glider and we said with an acoustic sensor, we'll reproduce what DAF are doing with a small boat. And effectively, this is our grid that we completed with a wave glider in a number of days to collect very similar data that they're collecting from the ship. And that data is now being looked at and analyzed to see how it compares with the boat and with the DAF acoustic sensors to see how they can really be added data benefits to this. Here's some of the data, just a little snapshot of the acoustic data. So here's the surface, and this is the acoustic profiles through the water column. So there's the bottom of the ocean. And you can see these blue patches is where there are these schools of very small fish. In this case, I think it was lanternfish or sardines that were being sampled. And so there's the echo sounder. We used the scientific grade 38 kilohertz echo sounder to measure some of these fish species. And we hope that all this additional data will be used by DAF and others to effectively manage better our fisheries stocks around our coast. There are many additional applications that can be applied, and I spoke about these earlier, and here's just a diagram to bring out some of those areas, the weather measurements there on the right, understanding who is exactly in our waters in terms of illegal activities that might be occurring and poaching. And then there's the others around the additional sciences for the mammals and other species living in the water, the oil and gas industry, etc. So what if we could provide safer operations that really are very cost effective? So we're receiving data at a much reduced cost ratio than we would be able to do using ships or aeroplanes or other surveys off South Africa's coastline. We could reduce those operational costs. We can expand the temporal coverage to almost near present, so 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and provide real-time data or real-time operations to result in real-time results for data management, etc. And so some of the, if we were to implement something of this nature at a more grander scale, we could start to look at how these sort of platforms could be locally manufactured. The private sector could be used to come and get involved and to manage some of these services that we have. They really are easily handled. They don't require a significant amount of infrastructure or maintenance to run these vehicles, and the data can be secured by South Africa and used appropriately where needed. And these really do derive new opportunities, economic opportunities as well for South Africa. So really it is an idea that we've shown is starting to really work for us very well, and we hope that this will really be enhanced to protect our valuable marine resources in South Africa and beyond. I have to acknowledge really some of our partners and in terms of funding and collaboration that have come out of it, particularly here locally, is the great investments that have come from the Departments of Science and Technology, our collaboration with the Antarctic Program, South African National Antarctic Program, and also that with Environmental Affairs and the use of the ship and space that we have down in Cape Town. Thank you very much.